The crimson dust of Mars swirled against the thick windows of the Olympus research station as Back pressed his warm body against Dr. Lee Era's leg. His brown eyes watched the storm outside, perhaps remembering a different sky, a different world. He was the last of his kind, the final pure-blooded Earth dog in existence. Era reached down to scratch behind his ears, feeling the soft fur beneath her fingers. Even after 3 years on Mars, she still marveled at how his coat remained glossy despite the artificial environment. Other animals hadn't adapted well to Mars, but Back seemed to thrive, as if understanding that he carried the legacy of all Earth's dogs within him. The lab was quiet this late in the evening. Most other scientists had retired to their quarters, leaving Era alone with her work and her faithful companion. The soft hum of machinery and the occasional beep from monitoring equipment provided a steady backdrop to her research. Screens displayed endless streams of genetic data. Back's DNA mapped out in glowing lines and patterns. "You're something special, aren't you?" she murmured, looking down at the dog. Back's tail thumped against the floor in response, his expression almost knowing. At 8 years old, he wasn't young anymore, but he carried himself with a dignity that reminded Era of the old hunting dogs she'd seen in videos of Earth. Earth. The thought of their lost home made her throat tight. The images from the last transmission still haunted her. Cities drowning under rising seas, forests burning, the air thick with toxic particles that choked the life from everything they touched. The environmental collapse had come faster than anyone predicted. When the atmosphere began breaking down, there had only been time to save a fraction of Earth's population and even fewer of its other species. Era turned back to her work, pulling up another set of genetic markers on her screen. The space station's artificial lighting cast everything in a harsh, sterile glow that made her eyes ache. She blinked, trying to focus on the data before her. Somewhere in Back's genetic code, she believed there were answers they desperately needed. A soft whine drew her attention. Back had moved to the observation window, his paws up on the ledge as he watched the Martian storm rage outside. The sight made her smile despite her exhaustion. Even here, millions of miles from where his species evolved, he still displayed the curiosity that had made dogs humanity's first and greatest animal allies. "Your ancestors helped us survive ice ages and hunt mammoths," she told him, walking over to join him at the window. "Now we need your help again, old friend." The door to the lab slid open with a soft hiss, making both Era and Back turn. Dr. Parkhan stood in the doorway, his lab coat wrinkled from a long day of work. Like many of the station's residents, dark circles shadowed his eyes. Sleep was a luxury few could afford these days. "Still at it?" Han asked, stepping into the lab. Back's tail wagged in greeting, but he stayed by Era's side. "The director's asking for updates on the genetic viability studies." Era sighed, running a hand through her short black hair. "Tell her it's promising. Back's genetic structure shows remarkable adaptability. If we can understand how his DNA maintains stability despite radiation exposure, it could help us develop better protections for our colonists." Han nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "The corporate council is getting impatient. They're talking about taking over the research directly." The word sent a chill down Era's spine. She'd seen what happened to research subjects when the corporations took control. Endless tests, surgical procedures, all in the name of progress. Her hand instinctively moved to rest on Back's head. "This is delicate work," she said firmly. "We can't rush it. One mistake could lose us everything we've learned so far." "I know." Han glanced at Back, his expression softening. "But we're running out of time. The latest atmospheric readings from Earth are worse than predicted, if we're going to find a way back home." He left the sentence unfinished, but Era understood. Earth's environment was deteriorating faster than anyone had expected. If they couldn't find a way to survive there soon, humanity might be trapped on Mars forever, or worse. Back moved between them, sensing the tension. He pressed against Han's legs, offering comfort in the way only dogs could. The simple gesture reminded Era why she had fought so hard to bring him to Mars in the first place. Dogs had stood beside humans through every major transition in their history. Something in their spirit, their unwavering loyalty, brought out the best in humanity. "Give me 3 more months," Era said, turning back to her screens. "There's something in his genetic code. Something we're missing. I can feel it." Han watched her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll do what I can to buy you time. But be careful, Era. The corporations aren't known for their patience." After Han left, Era returned to her work with renewed determination. Outside, the Martian storm continued to rage, but inside the lab, she and Bak remained focused on their task. As midnight approached, Bak dozed at her feet while she pored over genetic sequences. Just before exhaustion forced her to stop for the night, she noticed something unusual in the data, a pattern she hadn't seen before. Her heart began to race as she cross-referenced it with other samples. "Bak," she whispered, excitement making her voice shake. "I think you've been keeping secrets from us." The old dog lifted his head, brown eyes meeting hers with that same knowing look. In that moment, Era felt certain that he understood far more than anyone suspected. He wasn't just the last dog. He was a bridge between worlds, carrying within him the key to humanity's survival. As she shut down her workstation for the night, Era made a silent promise to protect him, no matter what came next. They were both a long way from home, but together, they might just find a way back. The fate of 2 worlds rested on an old dog and the woman who believed in him. The clock ticked past midnight in the Olympus research station as Era leaned closer to her screen, her eyes widening at the data before her. She had run this analysis hundreds of times before, but something was different tonight. In the quiet of the lab, with only Bak's gentle breathing beside her, she saw it, a pattern in his DNA that defied everything they knew about genetic adaptation. "This can't be right," she whispered, fingers flying across the keyboard as she ran the sequence again. But the results came back the same. Bak's genetic structure wasn't just stable, it was actively adapting to the Martian environment, changing in ways that should have been impossible. Bak lifted his head from his bed in the corner, ears perking up at the excitement in her voice. He padded over to her, tail wagging slowly as she pulled up comparison charts showing human genetic degradation on Mars alongside his DNA sequences. The implications made her hands shake. Humans were struggling to survive on Mars, their bodies breaking down under the constant radiation, their immune systems failing. But Bak's DNA showed signs of natural radiation resistance, and more importantly, his genetic code contained sequences that could potentially be adapted for human use. She worked through the night, running test after test, documenting everything. The sun was rising over the Martian horizon when she finally sat back, exhausted but certain of her discovery. Bak rested his head on her lap, and she smiled down at him. "You've been hiding something amazing all this time, haven't you?" she murmured, scratching behind his ears. "You might just save us all." The lab door slid open, startling them both. Dr. Parkhan stood there, his face grave. "Ara, we have a problem. The corporate alliance knows." Her blood ran cold. "How?" "I haven't reported my findings yet. Someone's been monitoring your data streams. They're on their way here now." Han glanced nervously over his shoulder. "You need to hide your research." Era's fingers flew across the keyboard, encrypting files and transferring them to secure storage. But before she could finish, heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor. 3 people in corporate suits entered the lab, led by Director Kang, the Corporate Alliance's chief scientific officer. "Dr. Lee," Kang said, his smile not reaching his eyes, "we're very interested in your recent discovery." Bak moved between Era and the newcomers, his posture tense but quiet. She rested a hand on his back, drawing comfort from his presence. "My research is preliminary," she said carefully. "Nothing has been confirmed yet." On the contrary, Kang held up a tablet displaying her latest results. Your data shows clear evidence of adaptive genetic sequences that could revolutionize human survival on Mars. The corporate alliance is taking over this project, effective immediately. You can't do that, Era protested. This is my research. Back is my responsibility. All research conducted in this facility belongs to the Alliance, Kang reminded her coldly. The dog will be transferred to our main laboratory for detailed study. Our teams are better equipped to explore these possibilities. Era knew what that meant. She had seen the corporate alliance's idea of research before. Endless surgeries, tissue sampling, with no regard for the subject's survival. They would tear back apart piece by piece to get what they wanted. He's not just a test subject, she argued, her voice rising. He's the last pure Earth dog in existence. We can't risk losing him. That's precisely why we need to extract as much data as possible while we can. Kang gestured, and 2 security officers entered the lab. The dog will be transferred immediately. You can continue your research under our supervision. Back growled softly, pressing closer to Era's legs. The security officers paused, watching him warily. He won't go with you, Era said, her mind racing. He only trusts me. You need my cooperation. Kang's smile turned cold. Your cooperation would be appreciated, Dr. Lee, but it's not required. We have ways of handling uncooperative test subjects. Han stepped forward. Director, please. Dr. Lee's methods are getting results. Disrupting her work now could set us back months. We'll take that risk. Kang nodded to the security officers. Remove the dog. As they moved forward, Era's hand tightened in Back's fur. The dog remained perfectly still, but she could feel the tension in his muscles. In that moment, she made her decision. Wait, she said quickly. Let me get his leash. He'll be calmer that way. Kang nodded impatiently. Era moved slowly to her desk, keeping her movements casual. She reached for the drawer where she kept Back's leash, and in one swift motion, hit the emergency quarantine button beneath her desk. Alarms blared through the lab. Steel shutters slammed down over the doors and windows, sealing them in. Kang's face contorted with rage. What are you doing? He demanded. Protecting my patient, Era said firmly. I'm declaring a level 3 quarantine. Protocol states no one can enter or leave until a full contamination check is completed. That will take at least 12 hours. You're making a mistake, Kang warned. This won't stop us. Maybe not, Era agreed, meeting his gaze steadily. But it gives me time to file my research with the Scientific Ethics Board. Once they see what you're planning. She left the threat hanging. The Ethics Board was one of the few organizations the corporate alliance couldn't control. If they saw evidence of planned animal cruelty, they could shut down the entire project. Kang's face darkened with fury, but he was trapped by protocol. This isn't over, Dr. Lee. When the quarantine lifts, we'll handle this legally, she finished for him, through proper channels. As Kang and his people retreated to the far side of the lab to weigh out the quarantine, Han gave her a subtle nod of approval. Back sat calmly at her feet, as if he understood exactly what she had done. Era knew she had only bought herself time. The corporate alliance wouldn't give up easily, not with such valuable research at stake. But as she looked down at Back, seeing the trust in his brown eyes, she knew she had made the right choice. They had 12 hours to find a way out of this trap. 12 hours to save the last dog on Mars. And with him, perhaps the future of humanity itself. The red emergency lights cast eerie shadows in the maintenance tunnel as Era, Duha, and Back crept through the narrow passage. The metal walls hummed with the sound of distant machinery, masking their footsteps. Back moved silently beside them, his nails clicking softly against the steel floor. The next security checkpoint is 200 meters ahead, Duha whispered, checking his tablet. We have 5 minutes before their next patrol. Era nodded, trying to calm her racing heart. They had escaped the lab during the confusion of shift change, using Duha's maintenance codes to access the underground tunnel network that connected Mars colonies. but they couldn't hide forever. A distant clang made them freeze. Back's ears perked up, but he remained quiet, trained to silence during their hasty escape. Era held her breath, counting seconds until the sound faded. "We need to move faster," Duha urged. "The corporate alliance will figure out these tunnels soon." They hurried forward, passing pipes and conduits that carried vital resources between colonies. The air grew thinner as they moved deeper into the maintenance level, their breathing becoming labored. Suddenly, Back stopped, his head turning sharply to the left. A moment later, they heard voices echoing through the tunnel behind them. "This way," Duha hissed, pulling them into a side passage. They pressed themselves against the wall as flashlight beams swept past their hiding spot. "Check every tunnel," a gruff voice ordered. "Director Kang wants them found before they can reach Olympus Mons." Era's hand tightened on Back's collar, her other hand covering his muzzle gently. The dog remained perfectly still, understanding the need for silence. They waited, barely breathing, as heavy boots passed their position. When the sounds faded, Duha checked his tablet again. They'd got patrols at all the main junctions. "We're trapped." "There has to be another way," Era whispered. "We can't let them take him." A soft click echoed behind them. They spun around to find a hidden door had opened in what they thought was solid wall. A woman stood in the opening, her finger pressed to her lips. "Quickly," she whispered, "before they come back." Era hesitated, but Back moved forward without fear, tail wagging slightly. She had learned to trust his judgment of people, so she followed, Duha close behind. The door sealed silently behind them, leading into a narrow corridor lit by soft blue lights. Their mysterious rescuer moved swiftly, leading them through a maze of passages. "I'm Sun," she said as they walked. "I'm with the Heritage Preservation Network. We've been watching Dr. Lee's research for months." "The Heritage Network?" Duha asked. "I thought that was just a rumor." Sun smiled grimly. "We're very real. We protect what's left of Earth's legacy: seeds, DNA samples, and living specimens like your friend here." Back wagged his tail at her words, making Sun's smile warm slightly. They emerged into a larger chamber filled with advanced equipment. Screens displayed data feeds from throughout the colony, and Era saw several people monitoring communications. "Welcome to our sanctuary," Sun said. "You'll be safe here while we arrange transport." "Transport where?" Era asked. "The corporate alliance controls all ships leaving Mars." "Not all of them." A tall man approached from a nearby console. "I'm Director Moon. We have our own vessels, hidden from corporate sensors. We can get you to the outer colonies." Era shook her head. "We can't leave. My research, Back's DNA could help save humanity. We need to find a way to continue our work." Moon and Sun exchanged looks. "We know," Sun said. "That's why we've been watching you. But the corporate alliance will never let you continue ethically. They'll destroy everything unique about him in their rush for results." "We have facilities," Moon added. "Hidden laboratories where you can continue your research safely. But we need to move quickly. Our sensors show the alliance is expanding their search." As if to confirm his words, alarms began blaring through the complex. One of the technicians called out, "Corporate security is sweeping the lower levels with thermal scanners." "Time to move," Sun said sharply. "The transport leaves in 10 minutes, with or without you." Era looked at Duha, who nodded. "We don't have a choice. They'll never stop hunting him now." They followed Sun through more hidden passages, moving upward through the colony structure. Back kept pace easily, showing no signs of fatigue despite their long flight. They emerged in what appeared to be an abandoned storage bay. A small transport ship sat ready, its engines humming quietly. Corporate patrols approaching from the south. A voice crackled over Sun's communicator. "Get on board," she ordered. "We'll hold them off." As they rushed toward the ship, the main door to the bay exploded inward. Security forces poured through, weapons raised. "Stop right there." Director Kane's voice boomed through a speaker. "Return the test subject immediately." Sun's people appeared from hidden positions, creating a barrier between the corporate forces and the ship. In the confusion, Era and Duha rushed aboard with Bak. "Launch now," Sun shouted, laying down covering fire with some kind of sonic weapon. The ship's engines roared to life. Through the viewport, Era watched the Heritage Network fighters holding back the corporate forces. As they lifted off, she saw Sun raise a hand in farewell before disappearing into the chaos below. "Course set for the outer colonies," the pilot announced. "We'll be dark for the next 6 hours to avoid detection." Era sank into a seat, finally allowing herself to breathe. Bak rested his head on her knee, his brown eyes full of trust. Duha squeezed her shoulder supportively. "What now?" he asked quietly. Era scratched behind Bak's ears, watching Mars fall away below them. "Now we finish what we started. But we do it right. No shortcuts, no cruelty. We find a way to save humanity without losing our own humanity in the process." The ship accelerated into the darkness of space, carrying with it the last pure Earth dog and the hopes of 2 worlds. Behind them, Mars grew smaller, and somewhere ahead lay their chance to make things right. The old mining outpost creaked and groaned under the constant assault of the Martian wind. Era watched through a dusty window as another storm approached, its red clouds promising days of isolation ahead. Behind her, Duha worked at a makeshift laboratory they had assembled from salvaged equipment and supplies provided by the Heritage Network. Bak lay curled up near the heater, his breathing steady in sleep. 3 weeks had passed since their escape from the Olympus research station, and the old dog had adapted to their fugitive life with remarkable resilience. "Era," Duha called out, his voice tight with excitement. "You need to see this." She turned from the window, crossing the room to where he sat surrounded by holographic displays. His fingers moved rapidly across the controls, bringing up complex genetic models. "Look at this sequence," he said, highlighting a strand of DNA. "I've been comparing Bak's genetic structure to every canine database we have access to. It doesn't match any modern breed." Era leaned closer, studying the pattern. "That's impossible. We documented his lineage back 5 generations. Modern generations, yes. But look at this." Duha pulled up another display, this one showing theoretical genetic models. "These are reconstructions of canine DNA from before the last ice age. The similarity is extraordinary." As Era watched, he overlaid the sequences. They matched almost perfectly. "How is this possible?" she whispered. "I don't know," Duha admitted. "But there's more." He brought up another set of data. "Watch what happens when I simulate environmental stress on his DNA." The genetic model shifted and adapted before their eyes, maintaining stability under conditions that should have caused breakdown. It was unlike anything Era had ever seen. Bak raised his head, watching them with those knowing brown eyes. He stood and patted over, as if aware they were discussing him. "His ancestors survived multiple extinction events," Duha explained, reaching down to pat Bak's head. "Ice ages, atmospheric changes, massive climate shifts. Somehow, that survival mechanism was preserved in his genetic line, dormant but intact." Era sat heavily in a nearby chair, her mind racing. "That's why he's adapting so well to Mars. His DNA is designed to handle extreme environmental changes." "Exactly." Duha's eyes shone with excitement. "But here's the real breakthrough. These adaptation mechanisms, they're not limited to his species. With the right modifications, they could be applied to other organisms, including plants," Era breathed, suddenly understanding. "Or bacteria. We could use this to restart Earth's biosphere," Duha finished. "Create new species capable of surviving in the current conditions, but with genetic links to the original ecosystem. It wouldn't be fast, but it could work." Era stared at Bak in wonder. The old dog wagged his tail, seeming to smile at them both. Their discussion was interrupted by a warning beep from their security system. Sun's face appeared on a communication screen. "Corporate ships are patrolling the sector," she reported. They're using new scanning technology. Your shelter might not stay hidden much longer. We need more time, Era said urgently. Du has found something incredible. This could change everything. Sun's expression grew serious as they explained the discovery. When they finished, she was silent for a long moment. This changes things, she finally said. If you're right, the corporate alliance can never get their hands on this research. They'd weaponize it, use it for profit instead of restoration. We need a real laboratory, Du has said. Somewhere we can properly test these theories. Sun nodded slowly. There might be a way. The network has a research facility hidden in the polar ice caps. It's risky getting there, but... A loud alarm cut through the conversation. Red lights flashed across their screens. Multiple ships approaching, Sun warned. They found you. Get out now. Era was already moving, grabbing their most essential equipment while Du had transferred their data to portable drives. Back stood alert, waiting by the emergency exit they had prepared. The storm, Era said suddenly. We can use it for cover. Duha looked at the approaching wall of red clouds dubiously. We'll be flying blind. Better than being caught. Era shouldered her pack. Sun, can you have a ship meet us on the other side? Already on it. Just stay alive. They sealed their environmental suits, Duha helping Era secure back in the special suit they'd designed for him. The dog remained calm, trusting them completely. As they prepared to leave, Era took one last look at the genetic displays still hovering in the air. In them, she saw not just Back's past, but Earth's future, a path back from the brink of extinction. The airlock cycled open, and they stepped out into the howling Martian storm. Visibility dropped to zero almost instantly, the wind buffeting them as they made their way toward their hidden vehicle. Behind them, corporate ships descended through the upper atmosphere, their searchlights barely visible through the dust storm. But ahead lay hope, not just for them, but for their entire lost world. As they drove into the heart of the storm, Back sat calmly between them, his presence a reminder of everything they were fighting for. In his ancient genes lay the secret to survival, passed down through countless generations of Earth's most faithful companions, waiting for the moment when humanity would need it most. The storm swallowed them completely, hiding them from their pursuers. Somewhere ahead lay the network's polar facility, and the chance to unlock the secret Back had carried across the solar system. They had started this journey to save one dog, but now that dog might save them all. Through the howling wind and swirling dust, they drove on, carrying with them the key to Earth's resurrection, written in the DNA of its last and most loyal friend. The ship shuddered violently as it hit Earth's upper atmosphere. Warning lights flashed across the cockpit as heat shields struggled against temperatures they were never designed to handle. Era held tight to her restraints, watching as Duha fought with the controls. Between them, secured in a special harness, Back remained eerily calm. Shields at 30%. Duha called out over the roar of re-entry. We're coming in too steep. The vessel groaned under the strain, pieces of the outer hull tearing away in their fiery descent. Through the viewport, Era could see the Earth below. But it wasn't the blue planet she remembered. Thick, greenish-brown clouds covered most of the surface, swirling in patterns that spoke of violent storms. 10 kilometers to touchdown, Duha announced, his voice tight with concentration. If we can just keep her together. They broke through the cloud layer into chaos. Toxic winds buffeted the ship, threatening to tear it apart. The Heritage Network's modifications held, but barely. Era could hear rivets popping under the strain. Back's ears perked up as they descended, his nose twitching as if he could already smell the world below. Despite everything, his tail wagged slightly. The landing was rough, throwing them against their restraints as the ship skidded across barren ground before coming to rest. For a long moment, they sat in silence, hardly believing they had made it. External atmosphere analysis complete, the ship's computer announced. Warning: toxic levels detected. Environmental suits required for surface activity. They suited up carefully, double-checking each other's seals. Era helped secure Bak's protective gear, making sure his breathing apparatus was properly fitted. The ship's airlock cycled open, and they stepped onto Earth for the first time in years. The landscape before them was alien. Dead trees stood like black skeletons against a poisonous sky, their branches bare and twisted. The ground was cracked and lifeless, covered in a fine gray dust that swirled in the toxic wind. "It's worse than the reports said," Duha whispered, his voice hollow in their comm system. Bak, however, seemed energized. Despite the hostile environment, he moved forward eagerly, pulling at his tether. His behavior puzzled them until their sensors picked up something unexpected. "There's movement in that valley," Era said, pointing to a depression in the landscape. "Something's alive down there." They followed Bak's lead, making their way carefully down the slope. As they descended, the toxic winds grew less severe, blocked by the valley walls. Their sensors showed slightly better air quality at the bottom. What they found took their breath away. In the shelter of the valley, protected from the worst of the storms, life had endured. Small, hardy plants pushed through the soil, their leaves tough and waxy. Tiny insects buzzed between them, and in the shadows, something that might have been a lizard darted away. "It's a microclimate," Duha said, excitement breaking through his professional tone. "The valley formation must protect it somehow." Bak moved among the plants with purpose, his nose working constantly. He seemed to be searching for something. Finally, he stopped at a cave entrance, partly hidden by surviving vegetation. Inside, their lights revealed an even more incredible sight. The cave walls were covered with a luminescent fungus, creating a soft, blue-green glow. The air was cleaner here. Their sensors showed it was almost breathable. "These life forms," Era said, taking samples carefully. "They've adapted to the new conditions, just like Bak's ancestors adapted to past disasters." "Look at this," Duha called from deeper in the cave. He was examining what appeared to be claw marks on the walls. "Something bigger lies here." As if in response to his words, they heard movement in the darkness. Bak's posture changed, alert but not aggressive. From the shadows emerged a creature that made them gasp. It looked like a cross between a wolf and something else, larger than normal, with thick, almost armored fur. Its eyes glowed slightly in their lights, adapted to the cave's darkness. But instead of attacking, it approached Bak cautiously. "It's impossible," Era whispered as the two canines sniffed each other. "The radiation levels. Nothing this size should have survived." "Unless," Duha said slowly, "it adapted the same way Bak's ancestors did. These might be descendants of dogs that survived the initial disaster." The wild creature retreated into the darkness, but its appearance gave them hope. If life could adapt here, in one of the most hostile environments on Earth, then Bak's genetic secrets might truly hold the key to restoration. They spent hours documenting everything they found in the valley and cave. Each discovery strengthened their theory. Life wasn't just surviving here, it was evolving, finding new ways to thrive in the changed world. As they worked, Bak moved between them, somehow seeming more vital, more alive than he had been on Mars. Something in this ruined world called to him, speaking to ancient memories coded in his DNA. "We need to find more places like this," Era said as they prepared to return to their ship. "Map out where life is holding on, understand how it's adapting, and stay ahead of the corporate alliance." Duha added grimly, "They'll be following us soon enough." Bak paused at the cave entrance, looking back into the darkness where the wild creature had vanished. His posture spoke of recognition, of connection to something primal and enduring. As they climbed out of the valley, the toxic winds howled above them, but they carried new hope. Earth wasn't dead, it was changing, evolving, just as it had done through countless disasters before. And in Bak's genes lay the blueprint for survival, passed down through generations of faithful companions who had helped humanity weather every storm. They had returned not to a dead world, but to one being reborn. Different, dangerous, but alive. And with what they had learned, they might help guide that rebirth, using the ancient wisdom carried in the genes of humanity's oldest friend. The old research facility hummed with power deep within the mountain. Era stood before the genetic extraction chamber, her hand resting on its cold surface. Behind her, screens displayed the results of months of work, successful test after successful test, each one bringing them closer to the final step. Duha worked at the main console, running final checks on their equipment. Neither of them spoke. The weight of what they were about to do filled the room with heavy silence. Back lay on his bed near Era's workstation, watching them with those wise brown eyes. At 10 years old now, his muzzle had grown wider, but his spirit remained strong. He had stayed by their side through everything. The flight from Mars, the dangerous return to Earth, months of hiding from corporate alliance hunters while they perfected their process. The simulations are all positive, Duha finally said, breaking the silence. The genetic extraction process would give us everything we need. Complete access to his adaptive sequences, enough material to seed thousands of restoration points. Era nodded, unable to speak. She knew the science was sound. Back's unique genetic structure could be used to create resilient variants of Earth species, plants and animals capable of surviving in the toxic environment while maintaining links to their original forms. It was everything they had worked for. But the cost. There has to be another way, she whispered, turning from the chamber. We could try partial extraction again. Duha shook his head sadly. We've tried 17 times. Partial samples don't contain the complete genetic keys we need. The adaptive sequences are too complex, too interconnected. We need his whole genetic structure, Era finished. I know. Back stood up and walked to her, pressing against her legs like he had done so many times before. His tail wagged gently, and when she knelt beside him, he licked her face. We don't have to do this, she told him, wrapping her arms around his warm body. We can find another solution. A distant rumble shook the facility. Warning lights flashed on their security screens. Corporate ships, Duha reported grimly. They found us. Multiple vessels entering the atmosphere. Era held back tighter. They had known this day would come. The corporate alliance had never stopped hunting them, determined to seize their research and back for their own purposes. How long? She asked. Maybe an hour before they reached the mountain. Their ground forces are already deploying. Back pulled away from Era's embrace. With steady steps, he walked to the extraction chamber's door. He sat before it, looking back at them expectantly. No, Era said, shaking her head. I won't do it. But Back stood firm. When she approached, he wagged his tail and nosed at the chamber's control panel. He knows, Duha said softly. He's always known, I think. From the moment we discovered what his genes could do. Another explosion rocked the facility, closer this time. On their screens, they could see corporate forces advancing through the valleys below. Back barked once, the sound echoing through the lab. His eyes met Era's, filled with the same trust and love they had shown since that first day in the Mars research station. With trembling fingers, Era opened the chamber. Back walked in without hesitation, turning once to sit facing them. His tail still wagged, even as the door began to close. Wait, Era called, her voice breaking. She ran to the chamber, pressing her hand against the clear barrier. On the other side, Back raised his paw to meet it. I love you, she whispered. You've been the best friend anyone could have. Back's tail wagged one final time. Then he settled down, calm and dignified, as if he understood exactly what his sacrifice would mean. Duha started the extraction process. The chamber filled with a soft blue light as complex machines began their work, carefully preserving every strand of Back's unique genetic code. Era stayed by the chamber, her hand pressed against it until the end. She felt Duha's hand on her shoulder as the light faded. He gave us everything, Duha said gently. Now we have to make it count. The genetic material they had extracted glowed in its containment unit, enough to seed 1,000 projects to help restore their dying world. In those carefully preserved strands of DNA lay the future of Earth, gifted to them by their oldest and most faithful friend. Corporate forces breached the outer defenses of the mountain as they finished securing the samples. But they had planned for this. Hidden passages would take them to a Heritage Network ship, waiting to carry them and their precious cargo to safety. As they prepared to leave, Era looked back one last time at the chamber where Bak had made his choice. In the end, he had shown them what it truly meant to be human, to sacrifice everything for the hope of a better tomorrow. Dogs have always given everything for us, Duha said as they hurried through the escape tunnel. From the first wolf that chose to sit by our fire, to the last dog who chose to save our world. It's written into their souls. Era clutched the container holding Bak's legacy. Above them, corporate ships prowled the skies, but they were too late. The secret of Earth's resurrection was already safe, preserved in the final gift of humanity's most loyal companion. They emerged into a hidden valley where their ship waited. As they lifted off, Era saw the mountain laboratory falling away below. Somewhere in those halls lay the body of her friend, but his spirit lived on in the precious cargo they carried, the key to humanity's future, freely given by the last dog on Earth. Green leaves rustled in the wind as Era walked up the gentle slope, her environmental suit replaced by simple protective clothing. The air still wasn't perfectly clean, but it was breathable now, filtered by the new vegetation that spread across the once dead landscape. Duha waited for her at the top of the hill, monitoring equipment spread out before him. 5 years of work had aged them both, but today their faces shone with the triumph of success. The latest readings are even better than expected, he said as she reached him. The new trees are processing toxins at 3 times the rate we projected. Era smiled, looking out over the valley below. Where there had once been only dust and poison, a forest was taking root. The trees weren't quite like the ones she remembered from her childhood. Their leaves were tougher, their bark resistant to the harsh conditions that still plagued Earth. But they were alive, and they were making the world better with every breath they took. Bak's genetic templates did this, she said softly, touching one of the nearby trunks. Its bark had a slight silvery sheen, a mark of the adaptive traits they had engineered using his DNA. A howl echoed across the valley, followed by another, then several more. Era turned toward the sound, her heart lifting as she caught glimpses of movement among the trees. The new pack is thriving, Duha reported, checking his tablet. 17 individuals now, all showing stable genetic profiles. The creatures that emerged at the forest's edge weren't quite dogs as they had once been. Like the trees, they had been engineered to survive in Earth's changed environment. Their fur had a metallic sheen that helped protect them from radiation, and they were larger than their ancestors. But in their eyes, Era saw the same intelligence, the same capacity for love that she had known in Bak. "They're beautiful," she whispered as one of the pack leaders approached them. The animal moved with confidence, showing no fear. Like all its kind, it carried strands of Bak's DNA woven through its genes, not just the physical adaptations, but somehow, impossibly, something of his spirit as well. The corporate alliance never understood, Duha said, watching the pack leaders sniff curiously at their equipment. They thought Bak's genes were just about survival, but it was always about more than that. Era nodded. The Heritage Network had helped them stay hidden while they worked, protecting them until their success was too complete to be stopped. Now, even the corporate alliance had to acknowledge that their way, patient, careful restoration rather than quick exploitation, had been right. The pack leader sat beside them as they worked, its posture reminding Era so much of Bak that her eyes filled with tears. After a moment, it threw back its head and howled. The sound carried across the valley, echoing off the mountains where their old laboratory still stood. "They're calling the others," Duha explained, checking his instruments. "Look." From other parts of the forest, more creatures emerged, not just the engineered canids, but other species they had created using Bak's genetic templates. Small, swift things that darted through the underbrush. Birds with iridescent feathers that could filter toxins from the air. Even insects, their wings shimmering with protective adaptations. Life finds a way, Era said, remembering something she had once read. We just helped it along. A younger canid bounded up the hill, carrying something in its mouth. It dropped a seed pod at Era's feet, one of the new plants they had engineered. Already, the species they had created were helping to spread life further, working together just as nature had always intended. The latest satellite images show green zones spreading on every continent, Duher reported. The restoration is accelerating faster than we predicted. In another decade, Earth will live again, Era finished. Different, but alive. The sun was setting now, its light filtered through clouds that were slowly, year by year, becoming less toxic. The pack leader stood, shaking out its metallic fur. It gave them one last look. A look so full of intelligence and purpose that Era felt Back's presence more strongly than ever. Then it turned and loped down the hill, gathering its pack with a series of short barks. They disappeared into the forest as darkness fell, but their howls lingered, carrying a message of life and hope across the healing land. Era and Duha packed up their equipment under the emerging stars. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges in their ongoing mission to restore their world. But tonight, they could rest knowing that Back's sacrifice had meant everything they had hoped. He would have loved this, Era said as they walked back to their research station, seeing life return, watching these new creatures thrive. He does see it, Duha replied gently. Through them, through every living thing that carries his gift. Above them, the stars shone brighter than they had in years, visible through air that grew cleaner with each passing day. Somewhere in the darkness, the howls of the new canids echoed again. Not quite dogs, not quite wolves, but something new. Something that carried within it the ancient bond between humans and their faithful companions, preserved and reborn in a world that was healing at last. The night air carried the scent of growing things, of life returning to a planet that had nearly died. And in that scent was the promise Back had given them, that life would always find a way forward, as long as there were those willing to help it along.